Hello everyone, Sophia Stoides here. Today on this podcast called What It Means to Be a Man in Canada, I'll be analyzing, reflecting, and arguing about Molson Canadian beer and their series of the ads called The Code. My goal for this podcast is for young adults living in Canada to understand how national stereotypes and requirements such as the Code reinforce inequality for men who do not meet these requirements, specifically queer men and men who are not white. The Code is a series of commercials part of advertising Molson Canadian beer. In The Code, a list of things are stated as a requirement to be a Canadian man. I'll now play the audio of Molson Canadian's beer ad, The Code number 2.
There's an unwritten code in Canada. If you live by it, chances are you have a hockey scar somewhere. You've gone on a road trip with a car that had no business going on a road trip. You're proud to know a girl who got jiggy with a pro hockey player. You feel kind of bad reclining your seat in an airplane. You've used a cheesy pickup line only because your buddy dared you. You fill your friend's pint before your own. You think hockey tape can fix anything. You've gotten kicked out of somewhere, and you've turned down a booty call in the postseason. This is our beer, Molson Canadian.
This ad reinforces a certain lifestyle that is nationally known in Canada to be the, quote, proper one to live. This lifestyle has been portrayed in Canada since the 1900s for men to be drinking beer with their other male friends as the norm. As we just listened, these set rules and requirements in the Code are reproducing and reinforcing inequality among men living in Canada who do not meet these set requirements, specifically singling out queer men and men who are not white as not part of the, quote, norm of being a man in Canada, which is this white heterosexual man watching or playing hockey, drinking beer, and hitting on women. My support for my argument is the creation of stereotypes about masculinity and the, quote, correct way to be a masculine man, what happens to men who do not fit the requirements, the Holy Trinity culture from nationality and lad culture, and use an intersectionality approach to this information to fully understand what queer men and not white men face. To understand how the Code promotes inequality among queer men and men who are not white, I will incorporate all my supporting arguments into the discussion of hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity confirms that the top tier for a man to be is a white heterosexual male, and the men who do not fit this norm are low status and below them. In this case, queer men and men who are not white. These men who are categorized as low status in the hierarchy of men face scrutiny regarding what it means to be a man and masculine because they are not top tier of, quote, real definition of a masculine man in Canada. The Code reinforces the development of a hierarchy in men regarding queer men and men who are not white as below the heterosexual white men in Canada. My first topic to cover is how gender stereotypes have been created based on biological reproductive systems and produced the definition of what it really means to be a man or female. I've decided to use Emily Martin's article called The Egg and the Sperm to give a base foundation of, in general, how stereotypes and norms of gender have been created. According to Martin, when society has looked at gender and what it means to be a man and female, they have connected biological reproductive systems in relation to gender, meaning male reproductive system of sperm have been recognized in society as stronger and superior than women's eggs. This is because of the point of view that male sperm goes on a mission to save the egg and reproduce, seen as superior and stronger than women's eggs. In the Code, the entire commercial is based on only men drinking beer and watching hockey, portraying that these men who do these actions is what it means to be a man. One of the lines in the commercial is, quote, you have a hockey scar somewhere, end quote, showing a picture of a man playing hockey with a bloody scar on his forehead. And if you're this so-called, quote, manly man in Canada, you have to have a hockey scar to prove your manliness. Masculinity and what being a man really means in Canada portrayed in the Code raises a few questions. What happens to the men who do not want to drink beer or watch hockey? Are they not considered men? Are they not considered Canadian? This is where my next topic comes into play. What happens to men who do not fit into the set requirement that Molson Canadian beer has reinforced of what it means to be a man in Canada? The set requirements of what it means to be a man and masculine in the Code further produces and reinforces inequality of these men who do not fit the set requirements of what it means to be a man in Canada. I'll be using the article Dude, Your F-Word Term, written by Pasco, to help understand this. In the article, Pasco discusses the F-word term as a word that males give to other males who display a certain act or trait that is not in line with masculinity. For example, being too emotional, dancing, or in regards to the code, not liking beer or hockey. In Pasco's research, he found that some boys who use this term do not correlate it with being gay, but just simply portray unmasculine traits, while others use it as a term to describe an act of showing femininity or a boy pretending to sexually desire other boys. These, quote, unmasculine traits that these males use to describe what it means to be masculine have been developed and created from gender stereotypes based on reproductive systems, as we discussed, and related to what it means to be a man and masculine. The main point of the code is to show what it means to be a man in Canada. It is almost a rule book or a guide to masculinity in Canada, which is to drink beer, watch hockey, and hit on women. Relating to the F-word discourse that Pasco discussed, all men in Canada who do not drink beer while watching hockey could be seen or called as the F-word. Something that I think is important to bring up is touching body contact of men with other men is something that is seen as, quote, not masculine. But for some reason, men who play hockey and are in contact all the time with other men and showering together are not seen as the F-word term. My question is, how do these men who play hockey and are touching, hitting, showering together all the time are not seen as the F-word term, even though they are technically going against these so-called requirements of masculinity that society has created? How are these inequality of men who do not perform or display the masculine characteristics get treated differently? Now, I will discuss how these men who break the, quote, unmasculine norm of being in close body contact with other men while playing hockey is because of the enforcement of the Holy Trinity from nationality and lad culture. It is important to connect the Holy Trinity, nationality, and lad culture to my argument of inequalities among men being produced by the code. I will be using two scholarly articles to help us use these concepts with the code. One called Globalization, Corporate Nationalism, and Masculinity in Canada, written by Jackson, and the second one, also written by Jackson with the help of Sundaram, called I Have a Sense That It's Probably Quite Bad, but because I don't see it, I don't know. The rise of globalization has contributed to corporate nationalism, and specifically in regards to the powerful culture of the Holy Trinity. Nationality is an identity that is known across the country as the norm identity to be. The Holy Trinity is a term nationally being reinforced and promoted across Canada, which is beer, sports, and masculinity, meaning masculinity is based upon men who drink beer and play sports, specifically hockey in Canada. Nationality in the code is displayed right at the beginning of the commercial. Quote, there is an unwritten code in Canada, end quote, then lists all the things to be Canadian. Without the commercial explicitly saying it, we know this code is specifically for men in Canada who drink beer and play hockey, based on the things listed and the people in the commercial, who are all white males. Thus, the norm of being a man in Canada nationally is drinking beer and or watching or playing hockey, which is being masculine, but as well as being produced is specifically all white males doing these activities is the norm of masculinity in the code. Lad culture is a culture associated with men drinking a lot of beer, sexism, and homophobia. This culture that is dominant in the UK can be associated with the code and what it is promoting in Canada. Lad culture in relation to the code can be correlated to the sexism and mistreatment of women from men. In the code, it is enforced, and I quote, blow off a booty call in the postseason, end quote, meaning that it is okay to blow girls off because men have this control over women. The whole idea of the code promotes that it's okay to blow women off for the men's liking, and that they are the ones in control, as well as it shows men are only able to like women as the norm, disregarding queer men. Both nationality and the Holy Trinity together with lad culture in the code shows the inequality created for men who do not participate in the norms nationally known, and reinforces men are allowed to be stronger and superior to women, and white heterosexual men as the national norm of doing these so-called masculine characteristics. All the topics I have discussed so far in relation to the code reinforces that men who play hockey are strong and masculine and have power over women because they are men. Men have to fit into specific masculine characteristics such as drinking beer. Men who do not fit these requirements could be not considered, quote, masculine men in Canada. And in relation to nationality, the Holy Trinity, and lad culture, a massive nationally known culture has been described as the norm in Canada of these white heterosexual men who play or watch hockey, drink beer, is the most masculine thing a man can do. As discussed about our topic of the F-word term, we now have an answer to our question. Why are these men who play hockey and get into close bodily contact with other men are not seen as the F-word term? That is because playing hockey and being rough with other men is seen as a very masculine thing in Canada because of the nationality of the Holy Trinity and lad culture. I will now use an intersectionality approach to help see the inequalities among these men who do not fit the requirement of being a white heterosexual male and what it does to them. All of these topics that I've brought up in regards to the code have been connected to how it promotes and reinforces inequality of men who do not meet the norm of being a white heterosexual male in Canada. To fully understand this, we must use an intersectionality approach. First, let me explain what this means. Using an intersectionality approach to something helps with an oppression. In this case, men in Canada who have to follow a set requirement list of what it means to be a man in Canada according to the code. Intersectionality means not just looking at men in general who do not portray masculine qualities as the oppressed, but the intersection of these men with other systems. The intersecting point of a queer man or a man who's not white, not portraying masculinity of drinking beer and watching hockey, face even more challenges compared to a white man who does not portray them. Because they are white, they do not experience as harsh scrutiny the men who have an intersection. Analyzing and reflecting the code with using an intersectionality approach, we are able to see how queer men and not white men face scrutiny from not fitting into the requirement of being a man in Canada. Queer men are not portrayed in the commercial as a norm. In fact, it is enforced that hitting on women and making them do what you say is the so-called norm. In other words, being a white heterosexual is the norm. Queer men could be worried to participate in drinking beer or watching hockey because they won't fit into this norm of the men who do this, which are the white heterosexual men in Canada. A queer man who wants to be acknowledged as a man in Canada will constantly get shut down based on the code because of who they are sexually attracted to and portray, quote, unmasculine characteristics according to society. The code enforces gender stereotypes of what it means to be masculine and the promotion of sexualizing women and not being queer, but rather heterosexual. Men of color are not accepted into this culture of beer and sports because it is shown as a white person's sport. In the code, every single man in the commercial promoting Molson Canadian beer is white. Men who are not white can still drink beer and watch hockey, but the entire national act of a man in Canada promoted by the code is white men participating in these activities, thus making men who are not white not feeling comfortable in participating in them. For example, to help me my point, I will give a stat. According to the 2020 NHL stats, 5% of the men playing hockey in the NHL are men of color, meaning only 43 out of over 700 men in the league are men of color. White men dominate and continue to portray the norm of playing or watching hockey, drinking beer as a white heterosexual male act, which is according to society in Canada the most manly thing a man can do. Does this mean that men who are not white and queer men will never be considered a man in Canada? This relates back to everything we have discussed about stereotypes being impeded on what it means to be a man and masculine. We are now at the end of my podcast, but I would like to discuss hegemonic masculinity to help wrap everything together that I've said so far, in order to understand how the inequalities among men are being reinforced and produced by the code, especially for queer men and men who are not white, because of a hierarchy, whom the white heterosexual men are at the top. Hegemonic masculinity is the term used for the dominance of men's characteristics of masculinity as top tier, according to the scholarly article written by MacDonald called Masculinity in Sport Revised, meaning men's dominance is not individually, but socially constructed in society as dominance everywhere. In regards to gender and biologically reproductive systems, there's a hegemonic masculine idea that men are just, quote, stronger than women and hold this higher hierarchy, just like the code enforces men to have to be these rough men playing hockey, which gain them this high hierarchy above women. Scrutiny is faced by men who do not fit into the requirement of being a man. In the code, queer men are not enforced as a norm, and that hitting on women and being heterosexual is the top norm hierarchy of men's sexuality. The Holy Trinity, nationality, and land culture were developed and created based on these biologically reproductive system characteristics and what happens when not adapting to them. This identity created on the Holy Trinity, being reinforced and promoted by nationality and land culture, is linked to hegemonic masculinity and nationalism. Being a white heterosexual man holding the national identity of the Holy Trinity and land culture is the highest tier of hierarchy a man can gain and uphold in Canada. It is important to use the intersectionality approach to this information as we did before, but now we can use it with the help of hegemonic masculinity. The code does not enforce queer men, not white men, as part of the norm of a man in Canada. In fact, they are categorized as subordinate and marginalized groups of hierarchy, meaning the subordinate group is homosexual men who have feminine characteristics and do not fit along the masculine hegemonic masculinity category. Men who are not white as not attaining the hegemonic masculinity because they are not white, and they will not get to this high hierarchy that these white men hold. Thus, the code is a reinforcer of inequality of men among Canada because of the development regarding gender stereotypes and upholding what it means to be a masculine man, specifically a white heterosexual man in Canada. That has been reinforced and produced by the Holy Trinity, nationality, and land culture that is in the code. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. I'm hoping all young adults living in Canada who've listened to this can take something away.